What could I possibly say about this game that hasn't already been said 1,000 times by 1,000 people? We all know that Wheatley's amazing. We all know that GLaDOS is amazing. We all know that the level design is fantastic. We all know that the addition of Cave Johnson was amazing. We all know that the level design is inventive and interesting and constantly mutating around itself to try and do the same general concepts in new and exciting ways. We know the additional mutators of adding the gels and the beams and the light barriers and all that was all something that just added fantastic mutation to the existing format without actually changing the core precept. We know that this is more of a game, whereas Portal 1 was more of a really, really good tech demo. I have nothing new to add to any of that. I know that these ruminations are supposed to be summaries of the stream, but I feel really redundant for just saying, this game be good, yo. It got a 264 on the golden number. That's a new record. This game, granted, there's a couple, I think actually 3 other games that might someday surpass this, but this might actually be the highest reviewed game we've ever covered. I'm not sure about that. It's the highest reviewed game under the current system, which is post-Oblivion line, but obviously there's a lot of games missing from that, so who knows, right? None of the games I think might beat this game have been reviewed under this system, let me just put it that way. So, holy crap, this game be good. I could talk about the lighting. There's a wonderful section where Wheatley is taking you through a completely dark section, and he serves as a flashlight. This is brilliantly designed in every way. Usually, video game flashlights suck, right? They don't know what to do with them. They're too narrow or they're too badly designed. There's not enough bleed off, and they don't really point the right way, and so they just kind of are irritating. In this case, they not only designed him to have more bleed off so you can actually see more around him and get a little bit of an insight into what's around, but also there's always thought being put into what he's pointing at. When you're going through a section where you're just exploring, he generally follows you. A little bit behind, but he follows your view. So he is pointing at what you're looking at, even though logically he had no way of doing that. So he functions as a flashlight, except anytime it hits a scripted point where it wants you to be looking in a direction, aware of a direction, or going in a direction, he points that way. And just that automatically draws your attention that way, and so now you know which way to go. In some cases, if you backtrack or you go the other way, he won't follow. So you will be going into total pitch blackness, and you have to follow that way. It's a quiet and yet very well presented way to use lighting as a tool in order to encourage you to move forwards. Well designed. I could just sit here and gush about every moment like that in the entire game, of which there are many. Forgive me for not doing that. Instead, I'm going to try to talk about some of the things that I haven't really heard a lot of other people talk about with regards to Portal 2. The first thing I want to talk about, and this is something they do both gameplay-wise and story-wise, is the whole game is structured in a way I don't often see in gaming. Something I talk about a lot is the staircase approach. You know, you introduce something, and then you have some time to play around with it. Then you make it harder, then you play it around with it, right? And usually staircase approach to game design is actually really good. This is more like House of Cards? I don't actually know what to call this, but that sounds flimsy, so I don't actually mean it like that. So let me explain this differently. The game will introduce a point, then it'll introduce another point, and then both will happen at the same time. Now, gameplay-wise, it's obvious how this happens. We get the portal gun, we see the laser, and then we see the God, I can't remember what it's called. The light beam barrier, the hard light thing, right? It's like, okay, although we don't actually see hard light till later, do we? Okay, that's an actually terrible example. So let me use a proper example and stop making a fool of myself on camera. I do that every day for a living anyway, so I guess that's just whatever. But they introduce the blue gel. Then we play around with the blue gel for a while. Then they introduce the orange gel. Then we play around with the orange gel for a while. And then they introduce levels that are centered around using both at the same time. Bam. A, B, both. That's the approach that the game uses constantly. But what's really interesting to me is they do the same thing narratively. What's the game start off with? Wheatley. And it's Wheatley, and it's Wheatley, and it's Wheatley, and it's Wheatley. And then, you know, we go through a whole bunch of stuff, and then we accidentally wake up GLaDOS because Wheatley's the worst. By the way, fun fact, if you ever replay this game, first of all, if you haven't done the developer's commentary, I highly recommend it. But second of all, one of the funny things is Wheatley, his big shtick, obviously they all say he's a moron, but the relevant point is that he makes bad decisions constantly. That's effectively his shtick, his failure, his flaw, if you will. And so he's always making bad decisions. And if you pay attention to him early on, you'll notice that that is what he's doing pretty consistently, making bad decisions. We don't notice as much because these bad decisions end up working out, either because of luck or because of us. But throughout the course of the game, that is consistently his thing. He is constantly making the wrong choice, like when he tries to keep us here rather than allowing us to escape, for example, was not exactly the best choice he could have made. Just to name one example. And then he ends up in space. So, oh yeah, memes. Let's get the memes out of the way. Gotta have the memes. Very important. We have Wheatley. And we introduce him, and he's brilliantly acted, and my favorite character in the game by far. And then GLaDOS knocks him away. And then we have GLaDOS for a while. Then we do some GLaDOS levels. And we're still getting visual storytelling this whole time. So when we go through the Wheatley section, everything's in ruins, and it's falling apart, and we're barely functional, and there's branches and leaves kind of growing into the facility. And then he gets knocked away, and then we have the GLaDOS levels. And during the GLaDOS levels, we actually see her trying to rebuild the stages and rebuild the buildings as we're going through the testing chambers. And it's always a slow progression in every case. In the first thing, we see it, and it's horrible, and then we get to the horrible ruins. And in her case, we start out absolutely horrible, and she's slowly rebuilding until we get to the second to last portal testing thing, where half of the testing chamber looks terrible, and the other half looks pristine. And then we get to the last chamber for her section, where everything is pristine, and it looks like a new testing chamber. But we actually see, the pieces of the wall and the pieces of the floor and the ceiling all kind of rebuilding and restructuring each other as they go. Wonderful visual storytelling. And it's literally adding a degree of what I love so much, which is visual continuity. We have a feeling for what's happening, where we are narratively, even if we don't know where we are geographically, because we can see the progression as we progress. So that's cool. But then after we finish those, we have, for a brief scene, admittedly, Wheatley and GLaDOS. And so that leads to the big confrontation and the big climax, which is honestly one of the better scenes of the game, and what is probably my second favorite line in the game. So, how are you holding up? Because I'm a potato. I can't even say it like she says it. She says it wonderfully. And then we plummet, and this is a good time to kind of pause, because I could talk about how we get Cave Johnson, and then we get GLaDOS back, and then we get Cave Johnson and GLaDOS at the same time. Or I could talk about how we see Wheatley again, and then we have GLaDOS, and then we have Wheatley and GLaDOS. Again, the whole game does this. A, B, both. A, B, both. Gameplay-wise, story-wise. It's a wonderful structure, and it works very well. Because it's all about introducing, establishing, then concluding, then doing something with it. I talk so much about both narratively and gameplay-wise. You need to hold off on the getting to the good stuff thing. I've talked about that constantly. And this game knows how to do that. It knows how to take its time and establish itself before it escalates. So, very staircasey. Anyways, this is a good time as any to pause and talk about something. I actually did talk about this on stream. Portal 2 is nonsense. There's no way that the miles down salt mine facilities are still working, and that the lines still have power, and that the triggers are still happening, and that the tests are still working, and that the wood hasn't rotten, and that the concrete hasn't fallen away, and that the power is still running, and that the pipes still connect all the way up to the upper facility, which is the one just below, the surface. There's no way all that works. Never mind the fact that she shouldn't even have air down that far. Or, things like, why is a bird getting down there? Or how did the potatoes grow as far as they do? All of these things are things that do not make sense, right? Am I dinging the game for any of these? No. Idiots on the internet have accused me periodically, although I shouldn't just be harsh about idiots on the internet, because idiots in life in general have accused me since about grade school of being too nitpicky and persnickety about certain facets of believability, internal consistency when it comes to fiction. You've probably heard the argument before. Oh, it's just a work of fiction. Who cares? Or you just take this too seriously, or you just demand too much realism, or whatever. I'm sure you've heard some version of that argument or another. I've seen so many comments which boil down to the same thing. It's usually said sardonically, where it's like, oh yeah, sure. You're fine with magic and fire flowers, but you draw the line at physics working this one way. And it's usually said as a way to try and be derisive and just kind of say, oh, your argument is stupid and you're stupid for having it. All those people are stupid. There goes half my audience. No, I mean, this is just the week of losing audience members, so it's whatever at this point. I'm just going to be honest about it. Because the reason that's stupid And the thing most people don't seem to understand is the reason those things bother me is because the game, book, movie, or show doesn't do enough to earn it. If I'm watching a bad episode and it does the stuff that Portal 2 does, that would irritate me. And I'd spend some time here sitting and discussing about how much nonsense it is and how nonsensical it is. Because after all, it's a bad episode. It didn't do anything to earn it. The phrase net positive exists for a reason. Portal 2 has gargantuan train-sized plot holes in it. Multiple of them. Quite a few of them, several of which would rather severely affect the overall narrative work. And yet it is a very well-written piece of work. It is very tightly crafted, has excellent dialogue, fantastic voice acting, amazing voice direction, some of the best pacing I've seen in fiction, both gameplay and story-wise. So I don't really care all that much. I will mention it, as I just did, and as I did on camera. And then I will move on, because I don't care. Because the rest of the work is good enough to make that work. Now, of course, I've noticed other people tend to have the same thing, even if they're not fully, putting a label on it or whatever. Some things tend to bother us more than others, right? A common trend I tend to notice is people who are into X, either as a job or as an enthusiasm, like a hobby, they tend to be more bothered when fiction screws X up, right? You're into physics or trains or computers or networking or cooking or time or whatever. I guess time's not a good example, but whatever, right? Whatever it is you're into. And when fiction screws it up, it tends to bother you more because you notice it, you recognize it. But even then, most people tend to be okay with it if the rest of it is good, if the rest of it earns it. And that is Portal 2 in a nutshell. One of the things that has really been driven home for me this week, especially as we've played both Spec Ops The Line and Far Cry New Dawn, is both games didn't really earn their core points. A point I stand behind even after further examination of both games. This is the inverse of that. Portal 2 has completely earned it to the point, I guess this is more the opposite, has earned it to the point where I'm willing to forgive the issues that do exist in the game. There are a few moments where it's just like, wait, what, really? And the stretching of disbelief on how little fall damage we take, for example, is nonsensical. The amount of interaction we have with extremely violent and dangerous chemicals is whatever. We probably should have lost our skull, face, and teeth about 15 times, even if you go through in a normal manner and actually solve the puzzles in the manner in which you're supposed to, and so forth and so on. But I'm willing to let go of all that because the game earned it. The game has earned that suspension for me. I've always thought of it as a bubble. And the more you push, the worse it gets, but the stronger the game, or show, or book, or movie is, the stronger that bubble is. I know this is a weird time to talk about it, but it felt like a good place to, especially given the games we've been covering this week. And especially since I don't know what else actually to talk about. I can talk about the priority list. One of the things that this game does is it fleshes out the lore and concept of the setting, and we see how Aperture Science is hell. Not literally hell, of course, that would be nonsense, but it is metaphorically hell. It is hell for the people who worked there. It is hell for the androids and bots who had to operate there. It is hell for GLaDOS, who has a thing that literally makes her compelled to test and gives her a hit, except she would become addicted to said hit after 3 or 4 tests, as we see with Wheatley. He has that first, oh, this is so good. And again, praise to the voice actor. The very next one, he's like, oh, that's the stuff. And the third one's like, yep, no, that's good. And you could feel and hear the less of the dopamine hit, or whatever the AI equivalent is for him, each time until finally it gets to the one where he's like, I'm just not feeling anything. Why am I not feeling anything? Okay, whatever, go test this one. And he tries to figure out some way around it, and he doesn't, blah, blah. My point is, this place is hell. Thank you, Cave Johnson, for making one of the most horrifically horrible places I have conceived of in fiction. Back in I think it was the 80s, in game, they started saying, you could test. Employee voluntary testing became a thing, and employees could volunteer themselves to test. And this goes back to the concept of the priority list. Before I go down all the details of just how horrific this is, what it really boils down to is the priority list. I've talked about this concept so many times, but in the off chance you've never heard me talk about it, the priority list is what matters more when there's a competition. So you want to do something fast, you want to do something good, but if you have to pick one, the one that's higher up on the list is the one you pick, right? If you want to make a good product, but you want to make money, if making money is a higher priority, then you will make a worse product to make more money, to use an example that happens every day ever. So, priority list, right? For them, the priority list had testing at the top of the list, either because of Cave Johnson himself or because just the attitude and culture of all the people who survived Cave Johnson's nightmare state and all the horrific stuff that was happening there. It was just testing. Cave Johnson actually has a line of dialogue at one point where he says, we're just throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks. We're just throwing science at the wall. And that is exactly what they're doing. These people develop functional AI, or at the very least VI, robots, android turrets for death machines, and all the stuff you can do with that. They develop the portal gun, of course. They develop these gels, which could do amazing things in certain ways. They develop hard light and the propulsion ray and all that fun stuff. They invent all these amazing things. They don't do anything with them. They just use them to test, because testing was the highest priority. And when the thing about the priority list that's really important to keep in mind is when anything on that priority list gets higher than, human lives. So, for example, going back to the company example, if you want to take care of your employees or make more money, which one's higher on the priority list? I'm sure a lot of you know exactly what that feels like from personal experience. Lord knows I do. But if you have a company where instead of making profits, it's testing is higher priority than employees. Testing is higher priority than making money. Testing is more higher priority than making a good product. Now you have just the nightmare hellscape that this game really is. And that's why I love the Half-Life series. I'm not into horror games or horror as a genre. I never have been. But I absolutely love horrifying things. We've talked about this a couple of times before. I need to come up with a new term for it. Tension was a word that was brought up, or something like that, tense things. I don't know. We can workshop that some more. But the point is, I like horrifying things far more than I like actual horror. Way, way back when we did our very first Halloween stream, before we even were calling them Polemic Day streams, we were streaming Half-Life 2. Because I wanted to stream a horrifying game for Halloween. We talked about it as we were going through. I actually played through and beat the whole game that day. And we were just talking, because it's a short game. We were talking about just how nightmarish and how horrific that game is. And Half-Life 2 is a little bit more on the sleeve than Portal and Portal 2 are. But it is the same setting, and it is just as messed up in the same manner. This is a horrifying setting, a horror setting, one might actually be willing to say. And that tone seeps into everything. This game in particular smothers most of that horror with comedy. But that just makes it dark comedy. It doesn't make it a comedy. It is interesting to think about just how messed up all of this is. I mean, just to give an example of this is a spoiler. There's a moment in time in which you save thousands, possibly tens of thousands of humans. Sweet. They all die within a week. Through testing. Now that's given in a one-off line, as GLaDOS is explaining stuff in the bonus super optional co-op campaign mode, which we did on camera. And it's done in a humorous fashion. But please think about that for a moment. Please think about exactly how fast she was churning through people in order to go through all those people in that short a period of time. 1 week. 1 week. And then you sit and you really think about it. And this is the kind of horror I like. It's the horror that gets more horrifying the more you think about it. Because Cave Johnson has several mentions down below, too, of exactly what they were doing to some of the people there. The Mantis Men. Oh yeah, that sounds funny. Think about how many of those Olympians and astronauts and war heroes became Mantis Men and then were killed by their fellows. Think about how many of them were doing the bone growth thing or peeing coal. It's all done by J.K. Simmons, so it's hysterical, but that paint that makes it comedy doesn't really change the fact that this is horrifying, and it always has been. Aperture has from its very beginning been a factory of churning through lives and absolutely killing and destroying lives on an unheard of scale to test and for no other reason. And that is wonderful Lovecraftian horror. Because I've talked about the 3 spokes of Lovecraftian horror before. One of those spokes is uncaring. There's no malice involved. That's important. Demonic horror. That's where something actually hates you and wants to hurt you. Lovecraftian horror doesn't care about you. Might not even notice you. You're not even relevant to it. You're just another piece of rubble on the conveyor belt that's about to be ground up into sand. And that's horrifying in its own right, isn't it? And that is Aperture in a nutshell. for all of the nightmare-scape that the Combine is, I think Aperture is actually worse in every way. And I wanted you to think about that. I'm curious if anybody has any thoughts, comments, or questions on this one, because again, this is kind of an unusual rumination because so much of Portal 2 is already known and already covered, and there's only so many times I could just say this game is great, this game is great, this game is great. One more time. This game is great. I hope you've enjoyed my thoughts and comments. We're going to go ahead and start up another horror game right after this. We'll see how that one works out. And I will see you around next time.